Kia ora koutou katoa, it's Mrs. Goodson here. This is lesson 6 for level 1 science about genetic variation. And today in this video, we're going to talk about mutations. And mutations are not just something from science fiction movies or science fiction stories. Mutations are just changes in the DNA that happen all the time. So we're going to describe a mutation and their role in forming new alleles. We're going to describe which mutations may be inherited and which cannot and explain why. And we're going to link beneficial mutations to survival and natural selection. So what is a mutation? So it's a good idea to learn this definition. It is a change in the base sequence of DNA that leads to new alleles. So for example, in this gene, there's a section of DNA, we've got a base sequence, and then one of the bases changes, okay? So it can be caused by chemicals or radiation, like UV light or smoking or other drugs and chemicals, but it does happen randomly all the time. They can have no effect, be beneficial, or be harmful. For example, they can lead to diseases like cancer. But most mutations just have no effect at all. So what causes them? So as I mentioned, we've got radiation, UV radiation, X-rays. We've got chemicals such as cigarettes and other drugs. We've got preservatives, barbecuing, that's the charcoal maybe, and other things, maybe in cosmetics, so chemicals. And we've got infectious agents like viruses and bacteria can also cause mutations. So these things that cause mutations are called mutagens. And gene mutations have been identified as the cause of several disorders, including sickle cell anemia, cystic fibrosis, and other diseases. Okay, so they can be bad, they can be good, they can just have no effect at all. So are they good or bad or neither? Sometimes the DNA changes can have no effect at all, and in fact, most mutations have no effect. For example, if the sequence AAG of the bases mutates into AAA, the protein is unaltered, it doesn't change, because both of the codons or both of those triplets code for the same amino acid. Therefore, in that case, there would be no effect on the organism, and this is the case for most genetic mutations. Very rarely, mutations have a significant impact on the living thing, the organism. For an example, it causes sickle cell anemia, and this is a change in the DNA sequence of the gene that codes for hemoglobin, which is the protein in red blood cells. And this is a picture of a normal red blood cell over here and a sickle cell anemic blood cell. So it changes the shape, it cannot carry oxygen as effectively, and so the person gets anemia, which means they not getting enough oxygen, they feel tired. So sometimes a mutation may result in a phenotype which is advantageous to the organism, making it more suited to the environment. So this is interesting because it can lead to a rapid change in the phenotype of the whole species. So if it makes a difference to an advantage, a benefit for the individuals, then those individuals will survive better and be able to pass on their mutation to the next generation, and they will survive better and be able to reproduce. And so that will might change the entire species or part of the species. So, can mutations be inherited? A mutation is a change in the DNA, and so if the change is in the DNA in the gametes, that's the egg or the sperm cell, then they can be passed on. If the mutation is in a body cell, which is also called a somatic cell, it cannot be passed on. So, for example, if the mutation was in your skin cells caused by UV light or something like that, it can't be passed on. But if the mutation is in a gamete cell, then the change in DNA will be passed on to the offspring. And this is an example over here, whether it will be observed or not. So if it's mutation, so we've got some chromosomes here. If the mutation is in this gene here and that is dominant, then it will be observed. If the new allele is dominant over the other gene, then it will always be observed if present. So that would be in the homozygous dominant or the heterozygous case. If it is a recessive allele, then it will only be observed if the individual has 2 matching copies. So it will only be observed if the individual is homozygous recessive. Sometimes an allele is recessive. It will not be observed unless there are 2 copies of it. If the individual is heterozygous, the gene is carried but not expressed. That means it's not observed. So in this example, we've got parents, we've got a mutation here. Both parents are carrying the mutation, but they are carriers. They wouldn't have the disease, so this mutation causes a disease. So this child here, unfortunately, has 2 copies of the gene, so they would be affected by this disease. And then we've got 2 offspring who are carriers, but they're heterozygous, but remember it's a recessive gene, so it's not going to show. And then this individual has 2 recessive genes, so does not have the disease and is not a carrier. So beneficial mutations help an individual survive better. For example, if they help a wild animal camouflage better or get more food, then their survival rate will improve. So if beneficial mutations have occurred in the gamete cells, then they can be passed down. Individuals that survive for longer are more likely to reproduce and pass on their successful genes. Over time, the species changes or evolves. Now, Charles Darwin was one of the scientists who was instrumental in coming up with this theory of natural selection, and he visited the Galapagos Islands in the Pacific aboard the HMS Beagle, that's a ship, and he noticed that the finches on different islands had different shaped beaks. So why do you think there would be? This is a picture of the finches that Darwin observed in the Galapagos Islands, and he wondered why. They had a common ancestor, but each species of finch had a different beak. So what maybe made them have different beaks depending on what island they came from? Have a think about it. So in this video, we've talked about mutations, which are not only from science fiction, and actually quite different. They're just changes in the DNA, and they create new alleles. So we've got creating new alleles. We've defined what mutations are. We've described mutations that can be inherited and which cannot. And then we've linked beneficial mutations to survival and natural selection. So mutations are a cause of genetic variation, and that's how it fits in to our whole topic.